Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. One of the most important dimensions in the uneasy relationship between the West and the Islamic world gets little attention from either the American public or their political leaders. The burgeoning Muslim population of Europe is already quite large and is destined for great increase in decades ahead. Now, while there has long been a Muslim presence in Europe, today's community is younger, more frustrated, and perhaps more devout than their forebears. In their impatience with a Europe that seems reluctant to include them, and an America whose policies they dislike, may lie seeds of conflict for years to come. Yet the fact that this community is for now overwhelmingly moderate in its expression and more ambivalent than hostile in its attitude suggests that there is still a chance for a more positive future. My guest is Zachary Shore, author of Breeding Bin Ladens, America, Islam, and the Future of Europe. Zach, welcome to Dialogue.
Good to be with you.
It's great to have you, and let me hold up this fine, handsome book for all to see, and let me go on record as saying for all to read. This is a book that I found immensely provocative in the very best sense of that word. And I think to start our conversation, Zach, one of the reasons I found it so is that to me the central proposition was this, that terrorists are bred, not born. And this vast, largely young Muslim population in Europe may be up for grabs in that sense, that the question is, will they become an integrated part of that continent or a kind of rejectionist front? That's my take. Would you agree that that's at least part of what this central argument of this book is?
Absolutely, that's exactly right. We're talking about Europe containing nearly 15 million moderate religious Muslims, only a small percent of whom are extremists, but those numbers are growing, and it's a disturbing trend, so we need to be focused on what's causing that, what are the roots of that. But the book is really about that deep ambivalence. So I try to point out that the overwhelming mass of those moderate Muslims in Europe do not hate America. And in fact, there's genuinely very little true anti-Americanism. But there is a great deal of ambivalence. Ambivalence toward America, toward Europe, and toward Islam's place in the European Union. And so for that reason, I speak a lot less in the book about anti-Americanism and much more about ambivalent Americanism, or what I call ambi-Americanism for short.
Well said, Zach, well said. And it strikes me, having read this book, that we're in a pivotal moment that can be either fruitful for us or, if there's such an expression, fruitful against us if we allow that to degenerate into anti-Americanism. Before going any further, what's your thought about why, and I mentioned in the introduction, this has gotten so little attention in our country. Let me cite just a couple of things. Everyone knows about 9/11, the whole world, obviously, and that was clearly an incident in which the perpetrators spent a lot of time in Hamburg. That was unknown. We have Madrid, we have London, Hamburg, etc., as examples of the worst that can happen. But to me, the surprising thing is, I don't think there's been much discussion in this country about this whole, the Muslim population of Europe in any sense. Did you share that?
No, you're right, and it's surprising because if for no other reason, security should be a primary concern for Americans. Americans need to understand that what's happening in Muslim Europe affects us here in America. So in addition to the things you listed, there's also the fact that the British foiled a plot last summer by young British Muslims to blow themselves up on planes bound for the United States. Some of the daily attacks on U.S. forces in Iraq have been traced back to European Muslims. And in fact, even that grisly murder of Theo van Gogh in Holland in 2004, a provocative Dutch filmmaker, that even involved America because his assassin, a Dutch-Moroccan man, pinned a 5-page murder note to his victim's corpse, and at the end he wrote, "I have no doubt that you, O America, will surely fall." You would think that what does America have to do with this issue, but in fact it's true that even in Europe some Muslims still see America as the enemy.
That's striking, Zach, and and that, of course, has brought forth that incident figures in this book, and it certainly shows why, among other reasons, we should be concerned. At the same time, I think it's important to point out that as we concern ourselves with the horror of, rightly, with the horror of terrorism, we have to be very careful about perhaps becoming too militant, too warlike in our response to it, too focused, if you will, on just viewing this as something we have to use the word combat all the time in kind of a military sense. Is that right?
Yes. Well, this is one of the major problems we confront, is that we, I think, have mistakenly employed, first of all, a military mindset, and second of all, military metaphors when they're not appropriate. So, for example, when we speak about a battle for hearts and minds or a war of ideas, we frame the issue, we frame Muslims as the enemy. And this then alienates the very people we want to attract.
Zach, to the extent, and that note that you mentioned was probably the most graphic and horrific instance of this, but to the extent that there is, now I speak of that vast core of the ambivalent circle, if you will, those whose minds are not quite made up, but who do have some sense of grievance against this country, or at least some doubt, perhaps better expressed. What would it be, Zach? What would be, how would you, I mean, if you can generalize about that, what America does wrong in their viewpoint, what would they say?
Let me tell you, to answer that, a little bit about how I wrote this book, and in that way come to answer this. I began writing this in early 2002, and I started by interviewing a wide range of Muslims across the continent in all points, from Copenhagen to Istanbul, London, across Germany, France, Holland, and many of these were one-off interviews, but others were ongoing conversations. I kept going back to the same people sometimes over the course of years to get deeper and more nuance to their views. One of those people, one of the ongoing conversations, was with a man named Mustafa Yosh. And he's a prominent Muslim leader in Hamburg. One time I asked him what he thought about Abu Ghraib, and he said, I have no doubt, actually he said, I am 100% certain that America's actions in Abu Ghraib have won thousands, possibly tens of thousands of supporters for bin Laden. And what he was really saying is that America's foreign policies, this is what he really went on to say, is breeding more and more bin Ladens. And what I try to do in the book is go beyond this idea. I do not see American foreign policies as the sole source of the problems in Europe, but one among many factors.
Right.
Some of the other factors that we have to keep in mind are Europe's failed integration strategies, the spread of radical Islamic preachings, and the widening gap between mainstream European and fundamentalist Muslim values.
Right.
All of these are contributing to the problems.
Well said, and in fact, and all of them are treated well in this book. On that last one, the question of values, it did seem to me that in this book, both in terms of the larger European community and specifically this country, there was a voiced concern from many people, men and women alike in the young Islamic world in Europe, about the, quote, the spiritual emptiness of American life, the suspicion that the sexualization of women, for example, in advertisements as they see it, and other forms of behavior simply are not conducive to the kind of life they think that people should be leading anywhere, that there's that problem.
Right. Well, there are a number of things happening here, and one of the larger trends, what's interesting from the research in this book, we look at Muslims from such diverse backgrounds, from so many different countries, speaking so many different languages all across Europe. You wouldn't expect that there would be any common trends or common opinions, but in fact there are some. And one of them is among the younger generations, those in their 20s and teens. What we're seeing is a rise in Pan-Islamism, the idea that, look, everyone wants to be part of something larger than themselves, right? Most people do. And if there is a sense that you as a Muslim do not fit in or feel accepted in the host country, in the European society, there's a search for a larger identity. So if it's not as a German or a French person, then it becomes, there's a turn to Islam. And as there is also this growing sense of siege, that Muslims around the world are under siege, that identity becomes heightened. So there are many factors that are fueling this Pan-Islamist identity.
Well, but I think the word identity is pivotal here. And
Yes.
it's in capital letters, in a sense, throughout this book, this quest for identity. And it seemed to me, Zach, to be made problematic or thwarted in a couple of ways. One is that in a lot of these European communities, Germany comes to mind immediately for me, this question of inclusiveness is difficult for the host country. In other words, it's something they don't seem to have wrestled with all that much in their past, originally inviting the Muslims in as guest workers and then finding themselves surprised the guest workers would have children and futures in that country. So there's that
That's right.
dimension of resistance to incorporating the Muslim community.
Right. So only now are the European states belatedly waking up to some of the problems that they themselves have helped to create. The problems surrounding Europe's Muslims do not have a sole cause. It's very important. And no one side is to blame for them, right? It's very important to keep in mind. But the Europeans were not alert to what was happening, to the alienation being created and to the exclusion. And so now there's a need for better, wiser policies, especially at the European Union level.
Right.
And there aren't any, surprisingly, or very few.
Which is, I'm going to mention Turkey in a few minutes because I think Turkey may be pivotal to helping turn some of that around. And there are some initiatives being taken. But you know, Zach, as I read this and thought about this particular example or aspect of what we're speaking of, I was struck by a great irony. And that is to say, Europe is aging. It needs these young people, just as they need an identity within Europe. In other words, if one looked toward the more hopeful possibilities, the better Europe is at incorporating this young population, the better their own futures become, I would think.
Yes. You know, the problem right now is that most of the scholarship and the commentary, even in the blogosphere, on this issue of Europe's Muslims involves a kind of Chicken Little aspect. The sky is falling, and you hear over and over, Muslims will take over the continent. It's going to be Eurabia, and it's the end of Western civilization. I am opposed to this view. It's wrong. Here's one reason why. As you say, yes, there is a need, because of the birth rates, to have a vibrant young population that is well integrated and be part of that labor force. But remember that the demographic projections people are so concerned about are just projections, and they rest on a single assumption. All projections rest on the assumption that current trends will continue indefinitely. Exactly, right. And there are reasons to think that they will not. One reason would be that if typically, as people are raised up into the middle class, they tend to have fewer children. And so those who are the most concerned about being overwhelmed by a huge Muslim population should be at the forefront of promoting wiser integration policies.
Well said. You know, and you know, it's interesting, we have a great debate in our own country, as you well know, about this question of immigration. And I quite frankly, I'll just by way of comment say that I consider immigration a positive phenomena, and a policy of inclusion of immigrants really the wisest way for modern states to go. I mean, that's what just strike me as wisdom.
It's not only wise, George, but it's essential. Because what is the alternative? The alternative would be a very dark scenario. Actually, I outline this in chapter 8 of the book. But in general, if people are not integrated into that society, you get social fragmentation and all the attendant social ills from lower academic achievement rates, higher unemployment, greater crime, and in some small cases, attraction to extremist messages.
Well said, and we're going to talk about that chapter 8, The Vision of the Future, in your book, which is hellish, quite frankly, if things do turn that way. But the book's main point is they don't have to, if people do things now. Zach, I want to bring in one dimension of everything in here that I think is really should be of great interest in an American audience. And you mentioned the book builds on people that you meet and speak to, and we get to meet these people. The opinions expressed are first person and heartfelt in every sense. In other words, you feel as a reader you're talking to them.
Yes.
There's a Mr. Khan, I think, who you try to get to talk about the reasons for violence. And you have to prod him a bit, because at first he wants to say there's no explanation, but of course there must be. He talks about, obviously, domestic mistreatment of Muslim communities, but then he also mentions, as do many others, foreign policy issues. And I was struck repeatedly by the primacy of Iraq in these were you too? I mean, this is really...
Of course. Iraq has become a major issue, but I would hope to underscore that the problems in Muslim Europe and the problems of America's perception within Muslim Europe predate Iraq, predate the Bush administration, and they will be with us after the Bush administration and after Iraq. So they go much deeper than that. But absolutely, right now, Iraq is on everyone's mind.
When you say they go much deeper, cite instances, Zach, of what you mean by that.
Well, let's think about Dilawar Khan, who was the director of the largest mosque in Western Europe, the East London Mosque in Bethnal Green. And I went to see him 1 week after the July 7th bombings of London, the ones that killed 55 people and wounded more than 700 others. We spent roughly an hour speaking, and he told me many things in that time. Among those things was that America wants to dominate the world's resources, that it wants to make sure that Muslim countries never become powerful, and that Israel controls U.S. foreign policy, and on. The important thing to note, whether you agree or disagree with Khan's views, is that this is how America is perceived, and that those perceptions are shared by many of his congregants. His congregants number in the thousands. But it does go beyond that. So, as you point out, I try to write the book. In a way, it's almost like a travelogue, because it's a series of interviews moving around the continent, talking with people. And what starts to emerge is more than just foreign policy. When you get people away from their official offices, from their official duties, when you break bread with them, when you really sit down and spend time with them and develop some kind of rapport and a bit of trust, then you get much more nuance to their views.
Absolutely. And in fact, let me bring in some of those nuances that I was struck by. And you know, foreign policy is obviously a big part of issues like this. But I was struck by the very personal litany, if you will, of reasons that young Muslims find their religion attractive these days. A sense of community, for example, which I've actually heard many Catholics in this country use almost the same language to describe their sense of belonging to a faith that's larger than they are in every sense. That kind of thing. So you know, there's much more to this on a personal level than we tend to think of.
Another one of the shortcomings in our policymaking, I think, is that we tend to look at what attracts people to either Islam, the religion, or Islamist movements in a more extreme sense, purely as a political act in order to redress economic grievances and socioeconomic disparities, rather than looking at the content of the religion itself and the values that underline it and how those things are attractive. The sense of community, the values placed on social justice and economic justice are part of it, but also the spiritual aspects that make people feel, again, part of something larger than themselves.
And the symbols of those spiritual acts, for example, hijab and the use of the scarf you bring out in this book, that in many cases we always associate that with kind of a militant statement. That's the way it's been presented in our country, but it's often a personal choice that a woman wants to make as an affirmation of faith in many instances. In other words, it's much more complex.
It's so much more complex. I tried to outline some of those reasons. Some women even wear headscarves, as some told me, to conceal their graying hair at an older age. You know, there are just many, many reasons why people wear them. In fact, in France, they've now coined the term, the typical term for the headscarf, the chador, has now been called the Chadior, after the Christian Dior, the designer.
Right. I have to laugh because I laughed when I first uncovered that. You mentioned the people in this book, and the people are the book largely. Let me mention to you one of my favorites, because I thought this young man made some striking comments. His name is Valija, I think. He's of Bosnian origin, but I think he's resident in Germany.
Right.
And he's making a comment about America that I found, it went right to my heart, in the sense that he found much to admire. But by the same token, Americans are uninformed, hence arrogant. They don't seem to, in other words, our knowledge base, even in a country that prides itself on so much media, is seriously deficient. And the attention we pay, the understanding we give to Muslims is insufficient and therefore resented.
Over and again.
Over and again, say
people
that.
Like Valija said, you know, it's the arrogance of your country and your people. You think, you know, I had some people give me very strong words, and then over time, modify them. So you have to understand the complexity involved. Sometimes people come across very harshly at first, and then when you get deeper down, they modify it. But that doesn't mean we should discount the sentiments at the start. And they do say often, there's a great deal of arrogance, a great deal of lack of understanding or information about the Muslim world. They see, one time in a mosque in Berlin, went to the largest mosque in Berlin that had not yet opened, built entirely from materials imported from Turkey. I was given a private tour, and some men that were sitting around outside the mosque talked with me for a few hours. And they said, we sometimes see satellite images of American soldiers putting their feet on Iraqis. And maybe this doesn't make your news, he said, but this is incredibly offensive to us, and you don't seem to understand. And they often liken the United States and Israel as being the most arrogant and the most oppressive, lacking a true understanding. Whether that's true or not, I think
that is
at the very least, that is the perception, and it's crippling.
You mentioned this earlier also in our own conversation, that there are steps underway. Obviously, governments are beginning or trying to do things. There's a cultural alliance, I think, in France, or rather in Spain,
yes,
a provisional Marshall Plan in France to better the situation of young Muslims, and initiatives I'm certain underway in Britain. This is an awful lot to try to summarize, Zach, but if you were to categorize those initiatives and their success, is it too little, too late? Is it proceeding? Or what's the story?
It's not too late, but it is too little.
Okay.
There's much more that could be done. I outlined some in the epilogue of the book, things that both Europe and the United States could do. In short, there's a need for more policies at the EU level, and there's a need, this is something that the Europeans are now waking up to, a need to get more sensible immigration laws to make sure that the imams who are in the country are what they call homegrown and understand the culture, speak the language of that country, and can then spread messages that are nonviolent and making sure that there is a place for Islam in the continent where Muslims feel respected, treated as equals, and stakeholders in that society.
You know, that comes through loud and clear to me. Hearing you say it, and having read the book, a place in the society. That sounds simple, but I think there's a profound meaning behind that, a sense of secure identity, belonging, that these things have to be incorporated. The famous chapter 8 of this book tells us what happens, or what might happen, if they don't wake up. This chapter has to be read in its own standing. I mean, it's a vision of hell. It seems to me a Europe that breaks down, that because the native populations, or the original population, loses sympathy, cannot identify with its young Muslims, cuts off social services, and, well, you describe it.
Right.
Why is it hell?
I should explain to your viewers that this is an academic book, peer-reviewed, but I had to persuade the academic reviewers on this one part of the book to let me put in what is a fictional account of a possible future scenario. And it describes, yes, one dark possibility, but I'm not suggesting that that is the necessary possibility, very important, only that if we rely on our projections assumption, if current trends continue, this is one way things could go that we would want to avoid. But I did this because I want people to see how dangerous it is, the kinds of policies that have been pursued so far.
Right.
And to see that we're looking at social fragmentation, which has major implications. When people are divided between religions and then between classes, it's never good for the society. In this particular case, it's even worse because of the underlying currents of violent extremism and always that potential for, I hate to use the phrase, but it's come into our lexicon, a clash of civilizations, which doesn't have to happen, can be avoided, and we can implement policies that will avoid that future.
And the we here is the Europeans and the Americans.
Absolutely.
Is that right? We have a stake in this.
Absolutely, we certainly do. Yeah.
You know, I mentioned Turkey in passing, and advocating Turkey's entrance in the European Union is not a focus of the book or anything, but it just occurs to me that when I think of the large number of Turkish workers and their heirs, now Germans really, 2 and 3 generations on, even the recent demonstrations in Turkey in support of secularism coexisting with Islam, these kinds of things, Zach, I sort of think that bringing Turkey into the EU may be one of the ways of well, bridging whatever gaps there may be, if you will. I don't know if I'm overstating it or understating it, but I did want to ask you that as I read this book.
It's a good question. I do believe Turkey will enter the EU, and I think it's a good thing that there's a process, an ongoing process, whereby that possibility for entry serves as an incentive to reform. You'll recall, not too long ago, maybe a year or two ago, the new, somewhat Islamist regime in Turkey wanted to make adultery a crime.
Right.
The EU immediately said, if you do that, forget about your chances. And they backed down.
Yeah.
That's the power of the EU incentive. And I think, therefore, the process needs to continue. But ultimately, it has to come to a conclusion. And I suspect we will see Turkey in the EU. And my hope is that it will be for the good.
I join you in that hope. Brad, as we come toward the end of this conclusion, I'd love for you, I know it's almost abrasive to ask you to such a complex question, but what's key here in terms of the American response to all that you raise in here? I mean, if you had to say, give your one prime sentence on this to an audience that really should read this book, what would it be that we have to take in mind as a result of everything you discuss here?
U.S. security is at stake in the problems of Europe's Muslims. But the overwhelming majority of Muslims do not hate America. They're deeply ambivalent. And so if we want to attract that vast number of ambivalent religious Muslims, we need to be thinking about wiser, sounder policies. That would be it.
And that's well said, and the book is well written. As I said at the outset, I not only enjoyed this book, I learned from it. I think it's a very necessary book. I commend you for writing it.
Thank you so much.
May you write more of these in the future.
Thank you.
We need them. And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at Dialogue at wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHC Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhcworldview.org. Please join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching this week. Zach Shore, thank you. You were marvelous.
Thank you, George.
You were a success.